the clue's in the name, baby boomer. There's a huge cohort of people of a similar age that have age stratified interests. So when you're young and earning money in your career, you're more likely to want low income taxation. In your retirement, where you've got a lot of wealth, you're probably very anti-wealth taxation. You're also going to be pro healthcare spending and social care spending.
Welcome to the IEA Podcast. My name is Matthew Lesh, and I'm the Head of Public Policy here at the IEA. Each week, this podcast asks a tantalising policy question to a top political and economic thinker. Today's question, is Britain generationally unfair? The UK is facing a toxic mix of low growth and an ageing population, meaning we've got fewer workers who are expected to pay higher taxes to support the healthcare, social care, and pension needs of an older population. Meanwhile, a younger generation is finding it increasingly difficult to afford a home while childcare costs are skyrocketing. So for many, indeed, it does seem the generational bargain is broken. To discuss this topic, I'm excited to be joined by James Sean Dickson. He's an independent researcher and commentator. He's the author of Himbonomics, a Substack newsletter, a regular contributor to the Unheard website, as well as the co-author of a new paper from the Adam Smith Institute entitled Boomer or Bust, Realigning Incentives to Reduce Intergenerational Inequality. James, let's start with a broader question here. I'm kind of interested in your thoughts on what is the generational bargain? What is the social contract between young and old? What would be the correct balance between the generations?
So I think the most important thing here is maybe if we think back to some of the stuff that David Willetts has talked about in particular, it is this view that the best way to have a cohesive, happy society is to have an intergenerational contract where everybody ends up better off than their parents. And for most of the 20th century, and for a fair proportion of the 21st century so far, that has been fulfilled. But if you look now at Britain's young people, and this is maybe replicated across a couple of other countries around the world, it's increasingly difficult to buy a home. Very often you're paying more and more in rent. And this is immediately you get into the weeds of people thinking, well, interest rates were bigger in the past and all this sort of stuff. Even adjusting for all of that, it is actually much more difficult. Childcare is extremely expensive. So for me, the perfect example of this is you imagine a young couple, perhaps in their mid-30s, they're probably still renting rather than owning. They don't have the ability to afford an extra room for a child if that were to come along. And it really starts to become scary on a fertility basis. You may not be able to have the family that you thought you wanted to have. And that's just, above all else, very sad. And I think this is something that older people in the country didn't even want. This is a really bad thing for everybody in society. So completely moving towards that society where everyone is benefiting from economic growth, benefiting from new technologies in society, that's where we want to head. And I don't think we're currently heading in that direction.
Yeah, I think there is an extremely strong case, indeed, that there is a sense in which it does not feel like younger people are going to have a better future. And that is, in a sense, intrinsically something quite kind of dark and negative for a society. I suppose you could counter that with, for most of human history, the difference between generations has been practically nil. The experience of the 19th and 20th century when things were rapidly improving, if anything, is particularly unique and strange and different. That's kind of a first thought. My second thought as well is, to what extent, I suppose, do you accept that there is a role in the state in terms of moving income between different age groups? So you have the welfare state effectively having two functions here. One function is in order to smooth out incomes between wealthy or high income and low income people who are in poverty, and some kind of level of transfer to those who are not the best off in society. We also, perhaps an even bigger function of welfare state here, is kind of smoothing incomes and support throughout the life. So early on in your life, you're supported by a state-funded education system, a state-subsidized university system, et cetera, et cetera. Then you enter a working age population, you start paying your taxes. And then when you're old, you kind of expect something back from the state, or at least you've been promised something back, perhaps wrongly so, but you've been promised healthcare, you've been promised social care, you've been promised pensions, and all those kind of things. Do you think, do you kind of buy that as a justifiable role of the state in the first place, and just think it's gone, I suppose, a little bit too far and it's imbalance? Or is there something wrong there that perhaps, I don't know, people should in fact save more during their lives, and we should expect people to fulfill more of the requirements of their retirement?
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to the very first question, insofar as you would usually say, and you would hope in most cases, that the role of a state is to facilitate economic growth, facilitate private citizens to have the best life that they can within the businesses that they operate and work in and live their lives and so on. However, if you've ended up with a society where you are unable to access wealth that previous generations have had, all of a sudden, all of these questions start going up in the air. You may be much more comfortable with lots of taxation on other people's wealth because that wealth is completely inaccessible to you. So really, this starts to become a danger for, any kind of right-thinking or center-right thinking people. If you don't like these outcomes, well, we're heading in that direction anyway. A generation locked out of wealth and capital is going to be very, very pro wealth taxation, I think. And it's something that has historically been very, very unpopular. You talk to the average person about inheritance tax and they despise it. It doesn't matter how much they are set to inherit. They feel it's deeply wrong. My argument would be actually the far greater problem, or the far greater concern, should be a deeply unequal society that has no buy-in to any of the things that make a society grow. And for me, that's just not sustainable. That creates a very unhappy citizenry.
Yeah, and I think kind of a certain political toxicity that I want to come back to in a moment. In terms of a way that you've framed this, you've become a little bit of a polemicist about those terrible boomers who are destroying society. And I will say some of our best friends are boomers, of course, maybe even our parents, and therefore in deserving respect. But I was wondering if you could explain to us what you mean by a Janet that you've written quite a lot about. Who is Janet? Where does she live, and what does she do?
Let's start off by first saying I'm being deliberately sort of iconoclastic and inflammatory to make a point. So one of the things that I love doing is making a point with data in a way that goes beyond sort of very grey looking tables that don't really sort of spark any interest or joy or humour. So it's a caricature, it's a humorous point, or what I hope is a humorous point. And basically, I'm sort of describing a lot of the things that we might notice in the boomer generation, sort of a love for Toby Carveries and Artex ceilings and all these sort of things that feel a bit anachronistic to us now. The central point is, and this is, again, I really don't, as much as I want to make humor of it, I don't want it to come across as nasty, because that's genuinely not the intention from it. The point is really with Janet to say, okay, she has no reason to buy into growth. If you look at planning permission, just as an example, we give a lot of weight to existing homeowners. So they've been settled in their area for a fairly decent amount of time. They vote heavily. They are likely to be listened to by their local councillors, et cetera, et cetera. And the idea of this character is that she's very happy to have her life as it is and stuck. And it's actually very reasonable for her to do that. The problem is that she doesn't realize that there are all these knock-on impacts from individual decisions. So each extra new house that is not built near her actually lowers the economic productivity of the region, because there are fewer workers for the local jobs. There are fewer people spending money in local businesses. But to her, that may not be worth the trade-off. So it may be, I'm going to have more road traffic. I'm going to have construction dust. I'm going to lose the view of a carpet warehouse across the street. It doesn't need to be a perfect, beautiful field. It just needs to be a small inconvenience to the life. It's something that, and again, the incentives mean that you don't need to buy into any of these changes. It's just that has a knock-on impact on society.
Yeah, I think the interesting phenomenon about the Janet is completely rational.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
In the fact that the Janet of the world is someone who says, I'm actually perfectly happy with the state of my community. I don't want any more traffic on the roads. I don't see any benefit to me personally of an additional house. In fact, most of the benefit, as you've said, will probably go to the developer or
to the landowner, or the actually managed to own the land before prices increased as well. I mean, this is why I really think, because it is fundamentally rational behavior, this is why it's meant to be iconoclastic for the purpose of being funny and making a point, not to sort of turn it into an intergenerational war. That's definitely not the point that's being made there.
Yeah, although at the same time, it does seem like the Janet has had a lot of political success. So it's not just in terms of blocking housing, but if you look at the recent autumn statement, not only, of course, was the government re-guaranteed the pension triple lock, there was also some like an additional 300 quid payment just because someone is a pensioner. And that's despite the fact that pensioners are actually these days less likely to be in poverty than a non-pension household. I also, in your recent report from the ASI, you point out, on average, working households with children have seen their net income fall by 21% because of welfare changes since 2010, while pensioners have seen their income go up 510 quid. So it seemed like we have a big kind of intergenerational transfer going on here to the generation from younger people. It doesn't necessarily feel righteous or fair.
Yeah, I think that's very much it. It's the fairness element of it. We should come on to the going beyond the fairness aspect in a moment. But one of the key points there is we have a large cohort of baby boomers. I mean, the clue's in the name, baby boomer. There's a huge cohort of people of a similar age that have age stratified interests. So when you're young and earning money in your career, you're more likely to want low income taxation. In your retirement, where you've got a lot of wealth, you're probably very anti-wealth taxation. You're also going to be pro healthcare spending and social care spending. So because you've got all these age stratified interests, you've got a huge cohort of people, which is, if anything, accelerated under first past the post. And actually young people need to go out and vote if they want their interests represented, which is another side problem. But we've effectively got, and this is where the Conservative Party has found itself after the 2010 period, where actually the young people voted in fairly decent numbers for the Conservative Party back for David Cameron. It's now, I think the latest polling is suggesting even under 50s, even in under 50s, you would have about 10% or just over voting for the party. So huge age stratified interests and one party chasing them has resulted in all of these outcomes.
Yeah, I almost even think that the Tories are potentially in a bit of an electoral trap here, which is you've got a need to appeal to that old generation, more or less, because these days they're the only ones left who are potentially voting for the Tories, or they're certainly voting for Tories in disproportionate numbers, which just makes
let's also say, like, how do people become conservative, or how do they become more likely to vote for a right-leaning party? Well, I think that's accumulation of wealth that they want to protect. It's accumulation of a sense of place in community, and it's having a family. And all of those three things, through transient renting and not owning a home and not having the ability to afford extra rooms and childcare, all of these things are contributing to a less conservative society. So, of course, the Conservative Party is sort of, I always put it like it's eating the seed corn, insofar as it's eating the corn that would grow the crops for tomorrow. There are going to be no Conservative voters tomorrow because they haven't got any reason to vote Conservative. There's literally no retail offer to them, and that is expressed very strongly in the percentage of people that would now vote for the Conservatives under, and again, not just under sort of under 30s, and they've just come out of all of the liberal left leaning institutions. It is people in their 30s and 40s that should be fully established in their life. Even they are turning against the party.
Yeah, I mean, I do want to just kind of challenge that thesis on the electoral logic a little bit, which is to say, there's a bit of a risk here that a lot of young people are actually more inclined to vote to the left, and even further left than the Labour Party, who they might think is not extreme enough, not even on economic grounds, but more on kind of cultural, symbolic grounds. And whilst older generations are willing to swap their vote between Labour and Tory on economic grounds, which basically means the Tories really have to appeal to that older generation on economic grounds, while I think it's very difficult, both for those economic reasons, but also that kind of cultural progressivism of younger people. But just to challenge the broader thesis here, I think the general feedback we get whenever we at least in my experience, people who are a little bit more critical on this line of thinking is, well, didn't baby boomers effectively earn what they're getting today? They spent a long period working in a time where generally standard of living was actually a bit lower. I think there's something genuinely true and reasonable to say that young people today do have the opportunity of low cost air travel. We have extraordinary access to technology that they didn't have access to, and effectively the boomer generation did their hard yards. They worked through it, and now it's perfectly reasonable and justified for them to want to reap the rewards of their hard work in terms of their continued home ownership, in terms of strong pension payments and transfers, and therefore, in fact, that there isn't as much unfairness in between generations as you're suggesting.
So I think there are two things to cover there. The first of which is if we look at sort of cheap flights to the south of Spain and so on. One is the economy has grown by, I don't know, goodness, maybe 4 or 5 times since then. You would actually expect some of these things to become more accessible to people. And I don't think we need to get into a debate of you should be grateful you're not living in a cave, because literally the productive growing economy enables more of these things to come through. And obviously it's not possible to go back in time and grant these increases in productivity and living standards back to the past, but actually the number of hours you have to work, plus the improvements in technology and fuel efficiency and all the rest of it, that has contributed to making things much cheaper than they are in terms of labor hours. So the amount of hours that I have to work in order to be able to go to the south of Spain, for instance, is probably equivalent or even less to the amount of hours that you'd have to work maybe in a manufacturing job or a much more manual job in, let's say, 1920. And you would, in that case, probably go to a seaside town instead, just because that is where your wages are able to afford. So firstly, we should be very pleased that we have a growing economy and society. Secondly, could you repeat the question, because I've forgotten where I'm going with this?
So the second point there is the sense in which the boomer generation, the older generation, did in fact pay. They paid their taxes in order to be able to access the services that they now expect, and they were promised these pensions. They were told, for better or worse, this is national insurance. You're paid your way. You have insured yourself against your future need for state support.
So this comes back to one of the central themes of both the original Triumph of Janet essay and the new paper. It's the concept of economic rent. And economic rent is not like regular rent paid to a landlord. Economic rent is what we might call excess profit in a transaction or in an asset price or something like that. And it's not caused by savvy investment. It's not caused by producing a better quality component or something like that than your competitor. It's by controlling the means of production or the means of supply in some way. So the example that I used in the Janet essay is that of black cabs. So I think everybody noticed that when some of the ride-sharing apps came into the UK, probably around 2010, suddenly the price of getting a taxi, a minicab out and about in London dropped really precipitously. So the reason for that is that you can restrict the supply of licenses and require additional training for drivers. And we saw with the advent of Google Maps and things like that, actually the value of that was not particularly large to the consumer. And we saw a huge growth in these services. That gap between the price of a black cab in the first place and what you're now paying for a taxi is the economic rent gap. So the way that this is expressed with house prices is, yes, absolutely. Like, I don't think it's any bad intention on behalf of the people that have owned houses in this generation. But if you are consistently blocking the supply of houses, we can't be surprised that prices have risen. Because there are literally more people with fewer units of housing per more people. So the price has gone up, and they have benefited from those economic rents. So in many cases, it's unintentional, of course, but they have actually benefited in a way that harms society. So this is the problem that I have with housing affordability, particularly.
Yeah, I mean, and I'd also just make the important point here when it comes to more direct state handouts, which is effectively there was a vicious case of overpromising here. People who paid in during their lifetimes are going to get out substantially more than any kind of contribution they made. There is no national insurance pot. It's all from current expenditure. Yeah. So we're taxing people today to fund pensions today. If national insurance, if you were to try to sell as a product, would be considered a Ponzi scheme.
The other thing with this is
the open market.
The economics are actually quite difficult insofar as you would actually expect most people to pay in less than they get paid out. And the reason for that is you have a consistently growing economy. So it's almost like you're leveraging the future productivity of the country in order to pay for current expenditure. You can look at it on relative terms. So actually we find through the Resolution Foundation, which has done a huge body of research on this. I really recommend it to people if they're interested in this subject area. But they found that the peak of benefit in terms of net extraction from the welfare state is actually around, I think it's 1967. And I gave a nod to him earlier, but that's actually David Willetts's birth year. So he said, I am the peak boomer in terms of net extraction from that. And again, this isn't intentional. This isn't done in any sort of, I want to steal from my grandchildren. It's just simply how all the incentives have played out to better them. And it is actually quite, I can get how people would be offended and find it an affront to say, you're trying to take out more than you put in, because there's just an assumption that there is a pot that they've paid into, and they are just taking from that pot. The reality, of course, we know that people get confused about national insurance and think of it as a contribution pot that they pay into. Actually, it's just general taxation, and that's a myth that has existed, I think, since the war. I think it changed after from 1920 to 1940 something. There was that system, but more than half a century later, we're still sort of basing our assumptions on this, which is pretty strange.
And the welfare state, of course, costs a lot more than the national insurance you even see in your tax.
Correct. Yes. Well, particularly as you have more dependents. I mean, this is literally the thing. The age or the dependency ratio. Following that huge boom in births, we had a bit of a glut, and that means that there are fewer workers now, or there are increasingly fewer workers than dependents. So that literally means you've got more people that are dependent on state healthcare, state spending, state pensions, all of this sort of thing. Ultimately, workers need to pay for that, because it is from the current taxes and current increases in debt that these benefits and state services are paid out from.
So yeah, let's move on here to what we think some of the solutions this might be, because I think that's really the focus of your new paper out with the ASI, which also contained a set of polling to try to ascertain what might be some relatively popular solutions to all these generational issues. In terms of what you're trying to think about here, which is as a premise, which is things that could be supported more broadly, things that shouldn't necessarily cause political friction, but you can get kind of wider levels of support for. What do you think some of the main findings were of that polling you did?
So one of the first things is to note is that there is now an increased acceptance that house building is absolutely necessary. So typically, again, that people have little reason to buy in, but if they're starting to notice, sort of, because they're very time delayed effects, that their children are still living at home into their 30s, that they can't afford a home of their own, all that sort of stuff, it starts to get noticed, and they start thinking, okay, maybe we do need more houses in my area. So we're starting to see subtle shifts in there. So part of it is literally waiting for these negative consequences to come out. The other side to it is literally giving people buy-in to some of the, or changing the incentives such that they buy into a change that benefits society. I mean, this is the key point, is if you consistently choke off growth by not building any houses in productive cities and regions, and strangling the supply of workers to the most productive businesses, lowering living standards, lowering taxation, etc., you're going to end up with a worse society as a whole. So actually, there are some ways to realign the incentives to do that. Some of the biggest support we saw was for changes to taxation. So one of the things that we found was that was popular is unfreezing the personal allowance threshold and indexing it to inflation. And the reason that's quite popular is it would effectively exempt a lot of 18 to 21-year-olds from income tax, because they have lower incomes, and that actually hopefully better enables them to start building a wealth base. And this is another thing that's really important about building a wealth base early, is if you do that, it can compound. And if you don't do that early, it becomes ever harder to actually sort of build up a wealth base for a future retirement. So I'm sure everyone's familiar with the principle in pensions, where the later you start building it, the more and more you have to literally throw at it. You have to throw everything you can at it. If you start building it later into your 30s, it's always better to go earlier if you can. A similar principle here of, if you have lower taxation on the youngest who are currently unable to build a wealth base, hopefully that enables them to build that wealth base. And again, if we don't do this, we will end up with a generation of people who have nothing to retire on. That is going to require a larger state and less personal choice.
You also talk about ideas that are probably a bit more controversial. I doubt you could find massive polling support for them, although they're probably quite popular. Things like removing the triple lock on pensions and means testing the state pension. I was wondering if you could talk us through your thinking on those fronts.
Yeah, it's definitely going to be a lot harder to do that. So I actually think it's one of the toughest things in politics, because this has been in place for a very long time. The newspapers like the Telegraph and the Express are very, very heavy campaigners on it, and you could say you get some of the most expensive front pages in history from supporting those policies. If you look on the other side for Labour, you can imagine that's the perfect attack line for the Conservatives in an election if they were to remove that.
Part of the history, of course, of the pension triple lock, at least according to one source, was the claim that it wasn't invented out of any particular thinking about generational reasons or pensioner poverty. It was just the fact that there was a spare square in David Cameron's media plan over a period of time. So they said, well, we need something to announce that day. Let's announce this triple lock. So it was the most expensive ever kind of media grid plan.
So the biggest sort of justification for moving away from it is that it's literally unsustainable. So maybe it's a question of this doesn't happen tomorrow, it doesn't happen in a year, it doesn't happen for a while. But ultimately, you need to start rolling the pitch that this is unaffordable in the long run. So if you have it as a combination of all three, 2.5%, I think it is, wage rises and inflation, it's always going to ratchet up, regardless of how the economy that underpins it is growing. So this is why it was suspended following the COVID massive decline in wages, followed by a massive rise in wages. Is we needed to prevent it accidentally rising by 10% or 11% just as a function of chaotic temporary weirdness. So it's literally unsustainable in that way. The argument
if you kept going with the triple lock pension, it would eventually take up like literally all the budget. But you're kind of just moving on. Another final idea you also had there was this personal development loans, kind of more positive idea, suggesting that young people should be able to kind of take a stack of cash to invest in themselves when they're young. How do you think that could operate?
Yeah, so it's maybe literally a matter of personal choice. So we heavily bias towards the university system, of course. They're also sort of self-justifying institutions. There is no reason that a young person who wants to invest in themselves, and we facilitate that with the university funding and university education, there's no reason that can't happen for apprenticeships and perhaps buying a set of tools or a van or something for a personal business. Those are equally investments in young people and their careers. So it's almost too simple to ramble on about for too long, because it's just a very simple nugget of idea. It's hopefully investing in those futures again, just through a different means.
Well, indeed. So we've got a bit of a conclusion here, which is generational fairness is important when generationally unfair, but a bunch of kind of creative policy solutions hopefully can try to fix the balance in the future. Thank you so much, James Sean Dickson, for joining us here on the IEA podcast. If you're enjoying the podcast, please do subscribe in your chosen podcast provider. And if you'd like to support the IEA, you can become a Patreon, and you can do that by visiting iea.org.uk.
Well, if you enjoyed that conversation, why not watch one of these other videos? And while you're here, remember to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss out on a single IEA broadcast.